This, of course, came as a huge shock, and William and I have been doing everything we can to process and manage this privately for the sake of our young family.
The history of the British royal family has always been filled with grand celebrations, public smiles, and an aura of perfect tradition that captivates millions of people around the world. However, behind the massive stone walls of the palace and the heavy golden curtains, there are stories that are never meant to be heard by the public. For many years, the public only saw Prince George as a happy royal child, waving gracefully to the crowds and standing alongside his loving parents, Prince William and Princess Catherine. But if we look closely at the archives from a decade ago, around the years 2015 to 2017, a highly unusual pattern begins to emerge. During that extended period, the young prince frequently appeared in public with an inexplicably tense, anxious, and deeply uncomfortable expression. He was just a toddler, a little boy who should have been filled with pure joy and carefree innocence. Yet his large round eyes often reflected a heavy, invisible burden. At the time, no one within the royal household offered any public explanation for this strange behavior. And as the years rolled by, those unusual signs were gradually forgotten by the media and buried under the fast-paced news cycle of the monarchy. The world simply assumed it was the natural shyness of a young child growing up under the intense glare of the global spotlight. However, the truth has a mysterious way of claws its way back to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried or how powerful the people trying to hide it are. In the early months of the year 2026, as a quiet and cold light, snow still fell gracefully outside the palace windows. An unexpected and highly private letter arrived at Prince William's office, instantly shattering the fragile peace of the royal household. The letter was not sent by a foreign dignitary, a politician, or a prominent public figure, but rather arrived in an old, weathered envelope with shaky, handwritten words that carried the weight of a decade-long secret. The sender was a former palace servant who had abruptly left royal service many years ago under mysterious circumstances. What made this letter immediately draw the attention of the prince's inner circle was its unusual nature, as the writer demanded absolutely no money, no financial compensation, and no public fame. Instead, the individual pleaded desperately for just one thing: a highly confidential and private face-to-face meeting with both Prince William and Princess Catherine. Sensing the genuine urgency and gravity of the words written on the paper, a discreet meeting was quickly arranged in a secluded room deep within the palace, far away from the prying eyes of the rest of the royal staff and court officials. The room was dark, illuminated only by a dim golden light that cast long, dramatic shadows across their serious and anxious faces. The middle-aged former servant sat directly opposite the royal couple, his hands clenched so tightly together that his knuckles turned white, his posture trembling, and his voice low but completely filled with raw, uncontainable emotion. He looked directly into the eyes of the future king and queen and stated that he had remained silent for far too long, and that his conscience would no longer allow him to carry this dark burden to his grave. With a shaky breath, the man began to recount a terrifying series of events that he had personally witnessed nearly 10 years earlier. He explained that during the years when Prince George was still a small, helpless, and completely innocent boy, a male servant who enjoyed a very close and trusted relationship with Queen Camilla would frequently approach the young prince whenever there were no other adults, parents, or nannies nearby. This specific servant did not approach the child with kindness or warmth, but instead always asserted firmly and coldly that he was acting on direct, explicit orders from Queen Camilla herself. The servant repeatedly told the vulnerable young boy that he must learn to be much more obedient, that his entire family was watching his every move, and that everyone would be deeply disappointed and angry with him if he made even the slightest mistake during his public appearances. The former servant recalled these moments with his voice choking back tears, describing how Prince George would instantly lower his head, his large round eyes filled with absolute confusion and fear. The boy was only 3 or 4 years old at the time, an age where a child cannot possibly distinguish between a genuine royal protocol and a cruel, targeted psychological manipulation. The servant did not stop at ordinary reminders or strict discipline, but instead systematically applied a subtle, terrifying form of psychological pressure that left the young prince in a constant, agonizing state of vague fear and anxiety. The servant would look down at the child and say in a piercingly cold voice that if he ever dared to tell his parents, William and Catherine, the queen would instantly know everything because she had eyes everywhere, adding that the queen absolutely did not like children who cried easily or showed weakness. Every single sentence spoken to the child invoked Queen Camilla's powerful name like a sharp, invisible weapon, completely brainwashing the small boy into believing that these cruel interactions were entirely permitted, monitored, and directed from the absolute highest authority in the palace. The former servant openly admitted to William and Catherine that he did not possess any direct physical evidence, such as secret videos or digital audio recordings, because bringing recording devices into those private quarters was strictly forbidden and highly dangerous. However, the incredibly specific and vivid details he described matched perfectly and terrifyingly with the haunting behavioral changes that William and Catherine had observed in their son all those years ago. They vividly remembered how George would sometimes become completely and unusually quiet, withdrawing from family activities, waking up in the dead of the night with a panicked, sweating look, or avoiding certain specific corridors and rooms of the palace without any logical explanation. At the time, overwhelmed by their massive royal duties, William and Catherine had simply assumed it was a completely normal, temporary phase of early childhood development or night terrors. But now, sitting in that dim room, listening to the raw testimony of a witness, everything suddenly appeared far clearer and infinitely more sinister. Prince William listened to the narrative with his face gradually darkening into a mask of pure fury, his jaw clenching tightly as he gripped Catherine's hand with immense strength, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper of suppressed anger. He stated with absolute resolve that if these words were true, they could not and would not let this stand, because George is their son and no one, regardless of their title or position, is ever allowed to hurt him or manipulate his mind like that. Catherine, however, did not speak a word immediately. She sat perfectly straight in her chair, her eyes blazing with an intense, unbreakable determination that only a mother protecting her child could possess. As a mother, she felt the pain like a physical knife cutting deeply through her heart, imagining her precious little boy, the child beloved by the entire nation for his radiant and beautiful smile, having to endure silent threats, invisible pressures, and psychological torment from an adult inside the supposed safety of their own home. She trembled with a mixture of profound sadness and righteous rage as she remembered the long-gone nights when a terrified little George would cling tightly to her dress, his small hands gripping the fabric as if his life depended on it, completely unable to explain what was wrong. At the time, she thought he was just being an affectionately shy boy, but now she understood with absolute horror that it might have been genuine, paralyzing fear of the adults around him. The former servant continued his emotional testimony, stating that he had personally witnessed the malicious servant approaching Prince George on multiple occasions. He described one specific incident where George was happily playing with his toys on the floor, when he was suddenly pulled into a dark corner of the room by the servant, who whispered something so cruel into his ear that the little boy began to sob silently, trying hard not to make sound. The witness wanted to intervene and protect the child, but the servant immediately turned around and warned him that this was the Queen's direct order and that no one was permitted to interfere unless they wanted to face severe consequences. The witness confessed that he was deeply afraid of losing his job, terrified of being dishonorably expelled from the royal household, and ruined socially, so he chose to stay silent and look the other way. Looking back now, after all these years, the man wept openly, expressing his deep, agonizing regret for his cowardice. Prince William nodded slowly, struggling with every ounce of his being to stay calm and rational. He knew very well that if this explosive news leaked to the global media before they had irrefutable, solid evidence, the British monarchy would face an unprecedented, catastrophic institutional crisis. But as a loving father, his protective instincts completely overrode his royal duties, and he promised the witness that a thorough, exhaustive investigation would be launched immediately. When the secret meeting finally ended and the former servant was safely escorted out, Catherine and William returned to their private quarters, where a heavy, suffocating atmosphere completely enveloped them. The initial testimony was like a slow-burning bomb hidden beneath the palace floors, threatening to not only destroy the family's remaining trust in the household, but also to open the door to much darker, more calculated secrets that no one had ever anticipated. Catherine knew with absolute certainty that the road ahead would be full of massive obstacles, powerful enemies, and institutional resistance. But as she stared out into the cold winter night, she was entirely ready to face the storm for the sake of George and the future of her family. Following that fateful and deeply unsettling meeting with the former palace servant, a heavy shroud of anxiety completely enveloped the private lives of Prince William and Princess Catherine. William, understanding the complex internal politics and the fragile nature of the royal institution better than anyone else, knew that if he were to initiate a formal or public inquiry, rumors would spread like wildfire through the ancient corridors of the palace. He looked at his wife, his voice dropping to a low, cautious, yet deeply trusting whisper as he formally entrusted the secret verification process entirely to Catherine, stressing that they could not afford to let a single soul know about this matter until they held absolute, undeniable results in their hands. Catherine nodded slowly, and in her eyes at that precise moment, there was not only the profound worry of a protective mother, but also a burning, unquenchable flame of sheer determination. She knew that the path ahead was fraught with immense institutional difficulties and hidden traps, but for the sake of George's psychological healing and justice, she was willing to do absolutely everything within her power. From the very next morning, Catherine began acting in complete secrecy, carefully utilizing her high status as the future queen to access the highly restricted royal personnel record storage system without drawing any unwanted attention from the senior courtiers. In the quiet days that followed, locked inside her private home office, she spent countless hours poring over dusty, decades-old archival documents, shift logs, and internal staff transfers from the years 2015 to 2017. The heavy silence of the room was broken only by the rhythmic, sharp sound of turning pages and her own deep, tensed breathing as the scattered pieces of the historical puzzle gradually began to fall into a terrifyingly logical place. The accused male servant, a man whose name appeared repeatedly as a highly trusted operative within Queen Camilla's inner circle, had suddenly and mysteriously resigned from his prestigious royal post just a few months after Prince George first began showing visible signs of intense psychological instability. The suspicious timing of his abrupt departure from the palace coincided perfectly with the exact months when little George would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, and the precise mornings when the young boy suddenly became deeply withdrawn, sullen, and uncharacteristically quiet. Catherine clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms as she read the official resignation letter, noting the total lack of a standard exit interview or logical explanation for a career royal staff member leaving so suddenly. What heightened her maternal suspicions even more was the chaotic and deliberately altered state of the official personnel management records directly related to this specific servant. Unlike the files of other palace employees, which were meticulously complete, chronologically orderly, and thoroughly detailed, this man's records contained severe, glaring gaps that could not be dismissed as mere bureaucratic oversight. Several crucial annual performance evaluations, background checks, and internal incident reports had completely vanished from the system, leaving behind only faintly erased pages and digital markers indicating that files had been permanently deleted by an administrative account with high-level clearance. Catherine whispered to herself in a voice filled with immense caution that this could never be a mere coincidence, realizing that someone very powerful had deliberately wiped the paper trail to protect the servant from future scrutiny. Beyond the highly suspicious paperwork, Catherine knew she needed real human voices to corroborate the story, so she began secretly contacting several former palace employees who still maintained quiet, informal ties with the wider royal household. She carefully chose highly trustworthy individuals, such as retired housekeepers and former guards who had transitioned to private sector jobs long ago and therefore felt less constrained by the strict royal non-disclosure agreements. These highly sensitive conversations took place over encrypted private phone lines or during extremely discreet, brief meetings in completely safe, mundane locations far outside the boundaries of London. One former palace employee, sounding visibly hesitant and trembling over the phone, confirmed that the accused servant always possessed a very special, almost unnatural freedom of movement throughout the private residences. The witness recalled once seeing the man enter the royal grandchildren's strictly private play area without reporting to the duty officer or logging his entry, noting that it was only much later that they learned through palace gossip that he acted as a confidential agent for one of Queen Camilla's closest personal aides. This verbal confirmation was somewhat vague, but carried immense structural weight, proving that the servant had a backdoor key to the children's lives. Another retired employee recounted a separate incident, remembering that the servant frequently received private, verbal instructions directly from Camilla's executive office rather than through the standard master of the household channels. Each individual account she gathered systematically strengthened Catherine's inner conviction, and although there was still no clear, smoking gun physical evidence like an explicit video or a signed document pointing directly to Camilla's personal handwriting, all the circumstantial details fit together perfectly. She began to paint a vivid, disturbing picture of a low-level servant who had been granted excessive, unchecked power, tolerated and shielded with Queen Camilla's massive shadow looming right behind him. She realized that Camilla, a woman who had historically struggled to assert her legitimate position and acceptance within the royal family, might have allowed this environment to exist. During those emotionally exhausting weeks, Catherine slept very little, completely unable to stop her mind from racing as she thought about her eldest son. Imagining a helpless, little Prince George facing profound fear and manipulation completely alone inside the royal palace itself made her heart ache with a deep maternal sorrow. She softly told herself that her son had been so incredibly strong to endure it, but at the exact same time, an uncontrollable, righteous anger surged through her veins at the thought of an adult using institutional power to terrify an innocent toddler. After nearly 2 weeks of intensive, quiet investigation, Catherine had successfully gathered enough initial pieces of evidence to take the next step. She called William over a highly secure private line, her voice completely resolute and unwavering as she informed him that what the former servant had shared was absolutely not a fabrication. She explained that she had discovered numerous matching points, including the sudden resignation, the missing personnel files, and the clear evidence that the servant was highly protected from Camilla's side of the house, concluding with absolute firmness that they needed to dig even deeper into the matter. Catherine smiled coldly, a look of pure steel entering her eyes, knowing full well that this internal war was only just beginning. Her initial suspicion had now fully solidified into an absolute belief, and that belief drove her relentlessly toward uncovering the absolute truth, no matter the massive institutional dangers, potential scandals, and immense pressures that would inevitably come from within the highest ranks of the royal family. As a fierce mother, she was fully prepared to burn bridges, because she would never let anyone hurt her child without paying the absolute price for their cruelty. The dangerous acceleration of Princess Catherine's secret investigation could no longer be contained within the silent, dark rooms of her private office. Within just 48 hours of her high-stakes meeting with a key suburban witness, news of her deep operational digging finally reached the panic-stricken ears of the former servant, causing him to urgently contact Queen Camilla's executive staff over a highly compromised phone line. His voice trembled uncontrollably as he warned the administration that Catherine was uncovering every single hidden file and that multiple former employees were currently cooperating with her personal team. Camilla received this alarming operational update on a quiet winter morning, her face instantly hardening into a mask of intense tactical focus as she realized that if the systematically buried actions of a decade ago were fully exposed to the global media, her historical reputation, hard-earned popularity, and constitutional position within the royal family would suffer a catastrophic blow. Concern instantly transformed into aggressive, calculated intervention as Camilla secretly authorized private meetings with the primary witnesses Catherine had spent weeks quietly cultivating. These high-pressure meetings took place in secure, distant locations far outside the main city center, where no direct physical threats were ever uttered, but the overwhelming institutional power, dark influence, and social weight of a reigning queen were more than enough to create an invisible wall of pure psychological intimidation. Furthermore, massive financial support packages and quiet career advancement for their children were subtly introduced as persuasive incentives for absolute silence, reminding the former employees that internal royal household matters must always remain buried within the family circle. The structural effect of this swift cover-up operation was immediate and devastating to Catherine's progress, as multiple key witnesses suddenly altered their cooperative attitudes, cutting off communication or citing sudden health crises to avoid attending the internal hearings. Catherine detected this coordinated anomaly immediately, analyzing the records with a cold fury as she noted that every single defecting witness shared historical or financial ties to Camilla's primary administrative office. She informed William in a private briefing that money and raw institutional power were actively being used to choke the truth, stating with absolute resolve that they could not allow these witnesses to be continuously suppressed. William, sharing his wife's profound anger but deeply worried for her personal safety, fully endorsed her next move, which was to immediately convene an emergency internal council consisting of senior royal family members, top-tier administrative directors, and legal advisors. As the highly anticipated internal confrontation finally commenced inside a tightly secured palace boardroom, the atmosphere became heavy enough to physically suffocate the attendees, with William sitting sternly beside his wife while Catherine stood up to present the exhaustive, irrefutable dossier. Her voice vibrated with a powerful mixture of professional clarity and raw maternal emotion as she laid out the missing shift logs, the altered electronic records, and the detailed testimonies proving that the male servant was the direct perpetrator of systematic psychological abuse against Prince George. More importantly, she explicitly connected the operational dots to Queen Camilla, highlighting her deliberate historical tolerance of the behavior, her systemic silence when early complaints were filed, and her recent aggressive maneuvers to actively buy the silence of key historical witnesses. Camilla sat directly opposite the future queen, maintaining a highly practiced, detached expression while her tightly clenched hands hidden beneath the table betrayed her true anxiety. When given the floor to defend herself, Camilla denied any personal malice, arguing that she had only ever desired for the young prince to be raised with strict, flawless constitutional discipline, and that any excessive actions taken by the servant were entirely his own rogue initiatives. However, Catherine swiftly dismantled the defense, stating firmly that deliberate blindness and the active obstruction of justice through witness tampering constituted a major institutional crime. The courtroom atmosphere completely froze as William spoke up in absolute solidarity with his wife, stating that they would no longer allow personal jealousy or palace power plays to destroy the psychological well-being of their children. The final internal ruling of the senior council was clear and absolute, formally recognizing the servant as the direct abuser while placing the primary administrative responsibility squarely on Camilla for historical negligence and active cover-up operations. Although the royal apparatus attempted to bury the final report to prevent a public disaster, critical elements of the investigation inevitably leaked to the global press, triggering a massive wave of public outrage against Camilla, while generating immense international admiration for Catherine as a fearless mother who stood against the monarchy's dark machine. Camilla faced a devastating, permanent loss of public trust, forcing her to retreat from prominent public duties into a quiet, heavily criticized isolation within the estate. For William and Catherine's immediate family, this painful ordeal ultimately served as a powerful, bonding crucible, allowing them to gently explain the truth to an older, resilient Prince George. This historical chapter does not merely expose a localized incident of palace bullying, but rather reveals the deep structural fractures, unchecked power dynamics, and the heavy emotional price that innocent children pay behind the gilded walls of royalty. Catherine proved to the world that a mother's fierce, protective love is infinitely more powerful than the most calculated institutional conspiracy, ensuring that the light of truth would finally pierce through the royal shadows.
Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also click the next video showing on your